The operation that led to the construction of the world's first atom bomb was codenamed the Manhattan Project, although it took place in the desert of New Mexico at Los Alamos. Under the auspices of Robert Oppenheimer, the bomb was detonated on the 16th of July 1945. 3 weeks later, a second bomb was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima.
Ruins of Hiroshima on screen. Pull back to show the technician at a switchboard. Behind him, Robert Oppenheimer, flanked by 3 middle-aged men in dark suits, with a cold, dead look of heavy power. The technician twiddles his knobs. He gives the OK sign. All clear. Are you sure? The technician shrugs. The instruments say so. Oppie says, thank God it wasn't a dud.
Before the desert was invaded by the scientists, it had been home to the Los Alamos Ranch School. The dawning of the nuclear age was to profoundly influence the consciousness of one of the school's pupils, William S. Burroughs. He, in turn, would alter the imaginative landscape of a whole generation with his extraordinary writing and his extraordinary lifestyle.
He's become this mysterious icon in a way, you know. I mean, I think people have a, you know, when people see his countenance in pictures or whatever, there's a certain cachet of like cool or of decadence that goes along with it, and it's I don't think most people get beyond that, you know, even to the point of, I don't think most people get to the actual books, you know, I mean, because they're very difficult reads, some of them. I mean, they're very complex and bizarre to get through. They're not structured like your average novel.
He kind of exemplified the decadent, glamorous junkie in a way, and that was cool. At that time, that was a very cool thing to sort of portray, and so, I mean, that was kind of interesting. I mean, for like, you know, a suburban, middle-class white kid, yeah. That imagery was really kind of striking.
I was born February 5, 1914 in St. Louis, Missouri. As a young child, I wanted to be a writer, and I wrote descriptions of corn dances in New Mexico that were much praised by my English teachers. I thought that they led very glamorous lives, living in Tangiers and smoking hashish and sniffing cocaine in Mayfair. It struck as being a very glamorous and easy and pleasant life. Little did I know.
Well, Burroughs grew up in St. Louis. He was born in 1914, so he comes from a Midwestern background at a time when people were still around who could remember the last Indian raids. But it was a time of, when he was an adolescent, still it was the peak of gangster activity in Chicago, let's say. Al Capone and all those people were at his height. Bill's own aunts all used to drive around town in steam cars, apparently. I mean, it was an extraordinary period in American history where absolutely anything went, really. You could, so it was the period of inventors, and his own grandfather had invented the adding machine, which made the family pretty wealthy, although they lost most of the money in the Depression. There was another grandfather who was a preacher. He would ride around from city to city delivering the gospel. And in fact, on his mother's side, the Lee family, there's supposed to be a connection with Robert E. Lee and all the great Confederate generals. St. Louis is sort of smack in the middle of the U.S. sort of culturally in that respect, with Chicago and the very sophisticated, as it were, society of the big city to the north, but the old southern attitudes to the south, and of course all these different ideas came up and down the Mississippi, so it was very much a melting pot of cultures and attitudes.
Burroughs' mother, Laura Lee, was a straight-laced lady, typical of the American upper middle class. His father, also William S. Burroughs, was austere and aloof.
It was a very formal kind of upbringing where he had to make an appointment to see his father. He would go duck hunting occasionally with his father and the chairman of the First St. Louis Bank, I think it was. They would get up and blast away at a few ducks in the morning, but it was very formal like that. He had a brother, Mortimer, who was the older brother, and I think he saw quite a lot of him, but he didn't. Even there, Bill seems to be very removed, a very sensitive child who lived very much in the kind of dream world that children have up until the age of about 7, except that to know what was real and what was not real in such a society where everything from Al Capone to his maid telling him, his nanny rather, telling him how to whistle up a toad. I mean, there were so many different realities, and Bill never really decided he had to make a distinction between these. He incorporated everything into his view of life, and people like his brother seemed very straight to him, I believe. Bill suffered from asthma and was sent to the Los Alamos Ranch School, which is where they later invented the atomic bomb, which he thought was very appropriate. And there he was forced to ride a pony, and no matter what the weather, they had to spend most of the day outside, I believe, except when they were in class. So all these poor young kids would be huddled in the doorways and trying to find shelter in the freezing rain up there.
At 15, I was sent to Los Alamos Ranch School for my health, where they later made the first atom bomb. It seemed so right somehow, like the school song. Far away and high on the mesa's crest, here's the life that all of us love best, Los Alamos. Far away and high on the mesa's crest, I was forced to become a Boy Scout.
So this was supposed to cure his asthma and make a man of him, but it didn't, of course. There's some very sad photographs of him sort of in his short pants wandering around.
Even as a child, Burroughs felt that he was different from the other boys. For one thing, his erotic fantasies were of a strictly homosexual nature.
It was there he first tried to come to terms with his homosexuality, I think, which he was unable to do. He felt very lonely and out of place, I think.
In 1932, at the age of 18, Burroughs entered Harvard University. He devoured the works of the romantic, opium-eating poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge and attended lectures by the American poet T.S. Eliot, also from St. Louis, whose Wasteland, published 10 years earlier, portrayed a post-apocalyptic landscape.
Burroughs didn't like Harvard at all. He was not a member of any of the clubs. I'm not sure whether they wouldn't have him or whether he didn't bother to apply. And he kept a ferret in his room, which the cleaners objected to very much. And he also had a gun, which he would occasionally wave at people and scare them.
The echoes of Burroughs are very strange. He's got a voice that's almost identical to T.S. Eliot's. Not surprising, they both went to Harvard. But I knew T.S. Eliot, and it was exactly the same voice. And there are so many echoes of Eliot in the work, obviously with a very early influence, as well as Zane Grey and other American Western writers, together with an extraordinary visual imagery, some of which comes directly from Hieronymus Bosch, and early Renaissance painters, with the extraordinary visions of human life on Earth being a form of hell.
After graduating from Harvard in 1936, Burroughs' parents sent him on a trip to Europe. He visited Paris, Vienna, Salzburg, Budapest, and Dubrovnik. There he met the German Jew Ilse Klapper. Foreseeing that the rising tide of European fascism would soon put her life in danger, Burroughs married her to provide her with American papers. For him, the marriage was a matter-of-fact, practical arrangement made to benefit a friend. His parents, however, were scandalized. Returning to America in 1937, Burroughs considered several careers.
I started out to be a doctor. Studied for almost a year in Vienna. That would be one of my alternative professions if I hadn't have been a writer. The other career that I missed out on was espionage. I was almost accepted by Colonel Bill Donovan, And then I ran into somebody who really hates me, or hated me at that time, my housemaster at Harvard, a guy named Baxter, and he put the skids to me. So I might have been head of the CIA.
He also toyed with the idea of being a gangster, because obviously gangsters were very big in those days. I mean, in 1927, Al Capone made $100 million. You know, and there was still a lot around, a lot of gangsters around, even in the period around the war. There was some plan which involved robbing a bank, which didn't work out because his cohorts didn't show up, or something bad happened, which was probably very fortunate. He spent his time working as a reporter and as an exterminator. I think he enjoyed that most of all. He worked as an exterminator for about 6 months, I think, going into people's buildings and spraying them with pytherium or pyrethium powder, I think it is. Something I don't think is used anymore. It's probably terribly toxic to kill bed bugs and cockroaches. That gave him great pleasure.
I have spotted a brown crack by the kitchen sink, put my bellows in and blow a load of the precious yellow powder. As if they had heard the last trumpet, the roaches stream out and flop in convulsions on the floor. Well, I never, says Mrs. Murphy, and turns me back as I advance with the coup de grace. Don't shoot them again. Just let them die.
In 1943, aged 29, Burroughs moved to New York City. There he met Jack Kerouac, Neil Cassidy, and Allen Ginsberg, who immediately became fascinated by him. In Burroughs' shadow, the Beat Generation was born.
When Burroughs got to New York, he had a friend called Lucian Carr, who he'd known from St. Louis, who came from the same kind of society background as himself. And Lucian was younger than him and going to Columbia University in New York. And through Lucian, he met Allen Ginsberg, who lived down the corridor from Lucian in Columbia Housing in 1943. And Ginsberg was only 17 at the time, and there's about a 15-year age difference. So as far as Ginsberg was concerned, Burroughs was this terribly old man, very experienced, absolutely fascinating, because Burroughs introduced him to all of these new writers, from Conrad to Celine, and a whole attitude, a much more sophisticated attitude that the sort of this young boy from New Jersey just had never seen anything like this.
1944, I went down with a friend who knew him from St. Louis, and who had introduced me and to Kerouac, and introduced Kerouac to Burroughs and me to Burroughs. I went down on Christmas, I think it was, to the Greenwich Village, to a little apartment on Morton Street. And my friend had gotten into a drunken fight in a lesbian bar with a lesbian lady. And there was some altercation, and Burroughs said, in the words of the immortal bard, "'tis too starved an argument for my sort." And I never heard anybody quote Shakespeare with such precision and humor and appositeness. And I just realized he was a very intelligent man, and I began listening to him. About a year later, Kerouac and I went to visit him to sort of examine him more closely, and, you know, we realized that we were going to see the Pope, so to speak. And he was very generous with his time and also his books. And I remember he gave me a copy of Blake. He just gave us the books that he would finished reading. One was Science and Sanity by Alfred Korzybski, basic Zen semantics. Almost like identical almost with Buddhist understanding of language. Spengler's Decline of the West, which was a crucial book because it sort of signaled the limits of empire, British and American, at a time when this was supposed to be the American century, as they say. And however, the message in the Spengler was that when a culture reaches a certain ripeness, then it begins declining into a civilization and a repetition and an exfoliation of the same original thought, Faustian grandeur. And that their empires rose and fell, and nobody thought in those terms in America in those days, but Bill was thinking in that. And this was completely out of sync with the common culture of the day as represented, say, by Time or Life magazine, which was a main medium of public communication then, mostly establishment culture or even CIA culture.
All those writers in general, I mean, they basically came of age in the 40s, really, during the war years, and, you know, which ended with atomic bombs going off, and I think their whole view of modern society was sort of colored by the fact that, you know, they existed in an age that almost could, for the first time, could just be, you know, evaporated at any moment, you know. And so I think that their view of the world was really colored by the fact that, you know, certain people with insidious power would have the capacity to really end the world, you know. And I think that had a lot to do with their questioning of, like, cultural values from the, you know, especially in the 50s and 60s when everything was changing so fast.
Scientists always said there is no such thing as a soul. Now they're in a position to prove it. Total death, soul death, is what the Egyptians called the second and final death. This awesome power to destroy souls forever is now vested in far-sighted and responsible men in the State Department, the CIA, and the Pentagon.
Although global destruction was only a button push away, New York, culturally, was booming. Burroughs moved among the worlds of jazz, of swinging bars and nightlife, and of drugs.
Sort of a buxom Irish maid, as I remember, said that she had heard that opium gives people pleasant, beautiful dreams. And since I was much plagued by nightmares as a child, in fact, it was one of the real influences in my childhood, the fear of nightmares. And so she said that when she said that opium gave you sweet dreams, I thought, well, that's for me. I'm going to get some of that. Phil White, the character Sailor in Naked Lunch, and myself got him started in a matter of speaking on morphine. Well, there was a knock on the door, and I opened it, and there stood Bob with this very sedate-looking gentleman who turned out to be Bill Burroughs.
I saw it happen. 10 pounds lost in 10 minutes, standing with a syringe in one hand, holding his pants up with the other. His abdicated flesh burning in a cold yellow halo, there in the New York hotel room. Night table litter of candy boxes, cigarette butts cascading out of 3 ashtrays, mosaic of sleepless nights and sudden food needs of the kicking addict, nursing his baby flesh.
The history of narcoticized literature is a history of narcissism, of narcissism in a sense, and that runs in an unbroken line straight back to De Quincey, who's the pivotal figure in that tradition. And I think that what these writers represent is, I think it was Cocteau who described drug addiction as a profound love affair that a man embarks upon with himself. And I think that all of these writers, in adopting this narcissistic perspective, are also inherently raising arms against the tyranny of, if you like, the patriarchal, liberal, bourgeois concept of what identity is and what personality is.
He had a fascination for lowlife. He always had been much more attracted to the criminal element and outsiders from society, not necessarily criminals, but people who were outside of the constraints of society, of high society that he grew up within. And his natural orientation was towards junkies and drunks and people living on the fringes of society.
They were bringing in stuff from stolen cars. Fritz, the old elevator man, said, I tell Mr. Hunky, all right, bring stuff what you steal from cars, but do not leave the car in front of the place.
The The criminal antics of Burroughs and his friends didn't go unnoticed by the police. In 1946, after being arrested for forging morphine prescriptions, Burroughs had to leave the city. He drifted through New Orleans, Texas, and New Mexico, scoring drugs and brushing with the law at every step. By 1949, America had become too hot for him, and in October of that year, he moved to Mexico City. His account of his own exploits as a petty criminal and drug addict was published 3 years later as the confessional novel Junkie, in which only the names of Burroughs' acquaintances are changed.
Totally autobiographical. Well, not patching of exaggeration here and there, and exquisite touches like the taxi cabs in New Orleans orienting themselves like bats with their horns. Very brilliant, later, sort of Naked Lunch type, or later Burroughs' uncanny perception. But mostly it's a bit outgrowth of that realistic style, of just a factualist style of accounting what happened and what the characters, scenes, picaresque in a sense, strung together by a theme rather than any particular plot, with very good character sketches of various people that I knew and he knew, but I knew through him. Herbert Huncke and Phil White and many others. The basic junkie population of Times Square and 103rd Street and Broadway.
I think that the text Junkie is fascinating to consider, both in terms of Burroughs' oeuvre and in terms of this whole issue of drugs and narcosis in literature, because I think, in a way, you could analyze Burroughs' entire oeuvre by comparing the text of Junkie with that of Naked Lunch. One is, Naked Lunch is fantastical, lurid, overtly symbolic, concerned with many parallel worlds of the imagination. Junkie appears to be a flat case of reportage, though of course it's a lot more than that. But I think that what Junkie brings to the fore is that we shouldn't perhaps be too taken by the drugs, like a sort of tabloid headline, into not regarding the writing that lies behind it. And in a way, Junkie, like all really good books about drugs, is not really about drugs at all. It's about a much wider sort of critique of the loss of subjectivity under late capitalism. It's about modern man cooking up his soul in a spoon and shooting it up into the Empyrean.
While in New York, Burroughs had met a kindred spirit. Joan Vollmer was both lively and intellectual, and Burroughs, who had previously sought sexual companionship with men, became her lover. Joan had accompanied him around America and lived with him in Mexico, where their intoxicated lifestyle continued, with disastrous results.
The whole business of Joan getting shot was yet again another of these very sloppy blunders. Burroughs had just been on one of his expeditions to South America with a boyfriend of his at the time called Marker, which had been unsuccessful both in as far as they hadn't found the drugs they were looking for, and his affair with Marker hadn't gone at all well either. So when he got back, he was in a very depressed state. And Joan, in the meantime, was drinking very, very heavily, drinking, I think, a bottle of tequila a day, and very, very drunken and sloppy, and I guess she used to take a tremendous amount of Benzedrine as well. By that time, Bill wasn't taking Benzedrine.